So we're going to be talking about his unbelievable book. I would call it a true masterpiece. Others have attempted to describe Francis Crick and write about him, but no one has come close to what Matthew has done. And really, I learned so much about this legend. Um, I guess before I get into the topic of who is Francis Crick, you brought him to light as a true giant of science in the level of Darwin, Mendel, Newton, Einstein. Is that fair? Is that a fair way to characterize him?
Well, yeah, I think it probably is because it's not simply the double helix, right? And the double helix is obviously important, but it's also a huge bit of luck, right? They were immensely lucky, and we can maybe talk about quite how lucky they were. And, Watson said to me about 5 years ago, he said, when I asked him what the most important thing he'd ever done was, and he immediately said, not the double helix, because it was inevitable. It was going to be discovered. The interesting thing is what happened afterwards. Nobody else, Watson and Franklin, both immediately stopped working on DNA and worked on RNA viruses. Wilkins, who carried on doing a lot of the grunt work of, really getting the model absolutely right. But Crick was the only person out of that whole group and many other people who actually thought about what does it mean? What does it mean to have found this double helix structure? And that changed the way we look at life, the way we look at its origin, its evolution, and introduced this informational idea about the nature of life and what is actually in genes. And that, whatever else we find out, that is going to persist for centuries. And that change is all down to him.
Yeah, no, I certainly would agree with the way you put him in that level of just extraordinary people who shape science, life science, especially in many ways, as we'll get into. Uh, and just so as we're getting warmed up here, this is Matthew Cobb's seventh book. Okay, and he has another one that he's working on heredity. So he's not gonna stop writing, and he is. We're glad for that. He's amazing. Now, I thought we'd start with all the insights I learned about Francis Crick from such a deep interrogation of what he was like. He, in many ways, was a challenging dogma, a boat rocker. But interestingly, besides being agnostic, he would throw racy parties. He was bohemian. He's a philanderer. He had an open marriage with his wife, Odile. Is how do you say it? For
Yeah.
55 years, even though he had affairs and whatnot. He was an intellectual snob. He never voted. He had no radio or TV until 1980. Um, so, arrogant, ruthless. He wrote about stuff that would be eugenics, quick-witted. But on the other hand, he would give talks to children. There are a lot of paradoxes about this man. And maybe you can kind of tell me, did I have it right that this guy was just a very unique character?
Well, I certainly don't think he'd last very long in modern day academia. Not only because he was rubbish at doing experiments and asking for money, he only ever applied for one large grant in his life, but clearly aspects of his behaviour would now be deemed unsuitable. I mean, that having been said, he had no. I mean, I knew about his affairs, which is one of the things that a lot of people want to talk about, and I realised very soon on that that was not going to give me much insight into his science, which is what I was really interested in, and so. Out of respect for the various people involved, I haven't actually named any names, and they're mentioned every now and again as kind of little bits of information, but they're not really important in understanding him. Unlike, say, Picasso, right? I mean, if you don't understand Picasso's affairs, you can't understand the various phases of his art because they're all linked with relationships with women. Whereas Crick, this is just something that goes on. But that having been said, I just want to make clear, in case it was unclear, none of his affairs with students or anybody with whom he had a position of authority. So, he wouldn't be drummed out for that. I just think people would raise their eyebrows. And certainly his views on eugenics which continued into the 1970s, would be seen as unacceptable today. Although I noticed that a lot of the tech bros have very similar ideas, because
Mm.
Crick's main interest, as he put it, was he had a prejudice against the poor, which seems very strange. And I think this is one of the actually really interesting things that I found in working on the book, because most of the science is either, there's bits of it, especially in his youth and early career, which are very detailed and a bit boring. But most of his later work is really big ideas. And what I wanted to do was to work out how on earth he was able to have all these ideas in his head. And then there's every time it touches anything to do with society, anything to do with politics, he's a complete ninny. So it was actually quite reassuring that this, he's not a complete genius in everything. There are parts of the world, in particular the social world, that he just doesn't understand and doesn't make the effort to try and work out what's going on. So there were times, most of the time, I was just kind of, astonished by quite how clever he was. But there are these other parts where I can see, no, you don't get it. You don't understand. There's this. So
Yeah,
why don't you understand it?
yeah,
And the book that I ended up putting him on was that these ideas come from his Edwardian past. So he's born in 1916, right? So that's a long time ago.
yeah,
Uh, and he imbibed all these ideas in the 1920s, which were as kind of nationalistic and stupid and, racist as you might expect, and never really interrogated them. And in most of his life, it had no consequence because he wasn't thinking about such things. But when he did, he kind of flipped back to this very old way of thinking.
yeah. No, and I thought there was some common ground there with James Watson, who also was known for his eugenics, race. I don't know. He also was a misogynist, but I mean, they shared these bad traits, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, Jim's actually a bit more interesting because one of the things I noticed was in 1972 there was a petition from to the academies, the National Academies of Science in the USA, to say that there should be support for research into the genetic basis of intelligence. Now, we know what they mean, right?
Yeah,
We know what they would know. Nothing about black people or anything like that was mentioned, but we know what they meant, and it was all to do, in particular, with the work of Arthur Jensen. And Crick signed this petition, and he got people like Jacques Monod to sign it. Uh, Jim Watson did not sign it.
mm,
And it
mm,
was all coached in terms of academic freedom. And Jim was much more left wing and very supportive, for example, of women in science in the 1960s. Something happened to him in the 80s and 90s where he changed his mind about a lot of these issues. And
yeah.
that will be the topic of not my book, but my good friend Nathaniel Comfort's forthcoming biography of Watson. And that's the riddle he's got to try and work out the answer to. That will be out in a year or so.
That'll be really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go into, how did Francis Crick get to this two careers, if you will, or starting two fields of science in many respects. But before we get to that, some background. I guess he was influenced by two scientists and their work, Linus Pauling and Edwin Schrodinger, and also by his children's encyclopedia.
Yeah,
Did
absolutely.
he tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he called it the most important book he ever read. And that's partly what gave me the clue to understanding him as having Edwardian aspects. So I thought, okay, but he said this when he was about 80, that this was the most important book he ever read. He kept it to the end of his life. His son Michael now has it, and it's incredibly well thumbed. The Cricks had the 8-volume bound edition. So this is an incredibly successful encyclopedia. And lots of people who I've met since have said, oh, I had that. My parents bought it. It went out of fashion about 1960, but it went through many editions. And I was able to read it online, and it is extraordinary in its breadth of topics that it covers. The edition that Francis had was from 1908. So
Oh,
the gene had barely been mentioned. barely been named, and there was nothing about heredity or anything like that in the book. In the book, but it was all these. It covered absolutely everything, from flowers to fairy stories to explanations of science, and in particular, it was aimed at kind of preteens, and it is so clearly written. And that's what he took from it. Not only the ideas, including because it was a British book about the empire and all the rest of it, but the clarity, how to write clearly and simply about science. And that's what he always tried to do. And that was definitely the most important book he read. And then the two inspirations that led him to make this shift in 1947. So you've got to remember, he's born in 1916. He started a PhD on what he described as the most boring topic in the world, which is the viscosity of water under pressure, because he was a physics student. Starts that in 1939. War breaks out. His lab gets shut. A German landmine falls on the equipment he built, so it was all out of couldn't be done anyway. He then does various things during the war. He works on mines, making mines that blow up ships. After the war, he does something rather mysterious that I still don't know about, really, in naval intelligence. And then in 1947, he's read one Linus Pauling talking about X-ray crystallography. And he's also read Schrödinger's What is Life, which again says you can use physical methods to get at the gene, to understand biology. And he decides there are two things he's really interested in, what he wants to study. He wants to understand the nature of consciousness, and he wants to understand the nature of life. So in 1947, he's charted out the
Yeah.
next 67 years or 57 years of his existence. And that's what he did. He decided that he'd deal with life first because it seemed a bit easier. Plus, there was the X-ray crystallography that might help, and that's what happened. So that's really everything follows from that decision in 1947.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because that was his first major pivot from the viscosity of hot water to go into biology and chemistry rather than physics to
Yeah,
start the field of molecular biology. So, a lot of people, this has been a very controversial thing about the discovery in February 1953 of the DNA structure and the other players, Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins. And you set the record straight. You really went into this.
well, I tried to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I've always wondered what the hell happened there. What really happened? What was the contribution of these different people? And everybody thinks that Watson and Crick, they worked together for decades when it was like
Yeah,
weeks. So
yeah,
maybe
absolutely.
you can fill in the holes there.
Well, that's going to be very tricky. So I'm gonna have to skip over a lot of the detail. Otherwise, we will get lost in the weeds, and we'll be here
Right.
for an
No.
hour or so.
Yeah.
So the key thing is you've got to. You're absolutely right. Watson and Crick were not. They only worked on DNA for about 6 weeks. Neither of them were supposed to be studying it. Uh, Crick, as his boss, Sir Lawrence Bragg, said, was a chap who liked doing other people's crosswords. So if you had a problem, Crick would find the answer to it, even if you didn't want to. He was always interested in other people's things and other and experiments that had just come out. How could you interpret them and so on? Probably quite infuriating. Certainly Bragg found it so. Watson was much younger. He was, 8 years younger, and he arrived in 1951 at Cambridge. And he too was not working on DNA. They were both working on protein structure, which is what they studied at Cambridge. But Crick's very good friend, Maurice Wilkins, had been working on DNA first using microscopes and then using X-ray crystallography for about 6 years. Indeed, Crick nearly went and worked with him at King's College, Cambridge, London, but it didn't work out. Now, so Crick knew what was happening all along in London because Wilkins would come along and they'd have dinner and have a drink, and Wilkins would chat, and he would also complain about Rosalind Franklin. And because Franklin and Wilkins just didn't get on. Wilkins was very introverted, very quiet, didn't like argument. Franklin was very vivacious. She came from an intellectual Jewish family that liked to have a good argument about anything, because that's the way you develop your ideas.
Yeah.
So these two people just could not work together. And that's part of the tragedy. And Watson always said this, that if they'd been able to work together, we'd talk about the Wilkins-Franklin or Franklin-Wilkins structure, not about Watson and Crick. They would have been nowhere. So there's been lots of problems, incredibly slow work in King's College London. And then at the end of 1952, the people in Cambridge hear that Linus Pauling has produced a version of the structure of DNA. And they knew this because Linus's son, Peter, happened to be doing his PhD in Cambridge. In the same office as Watson and Crick. So he says, oh, we're going to get this letter. And Crick has been warning the people in London, saying the big bad wolf is going to find the solution if you people don't. So now we've got a situation in which they've got this manuscript from Linus Pauling, which is not right. It's similar to an idea that Watson and Crick had about 15 months earlier, and it's inside out. It's got 3 helices. It's not right. And Bragg, who really didn't like Crick and didn't really know much about Watson at all, is persuaded because he's got a beef. He's had a beef with Pauling for reasons we don't need to go into. And so the idea of stealing a march on Pauling is too much for him to resist. And he says, okay, Watson and Crick, you've got a few weeks to try and do this. And above all, he does not contact his colleagues in London saying, oh, by the way, we're moving in on your territory. Meanwhile, back in London, things have gone from bad to worse. And Franklin, she decided virtually as soon as she met Wilkins, she wanted to leave, right? But she's now on the way out. She's going to another laboratory in London in Birkbeck to work with J.D. Bernal, but not on DNA, because the head of the King's College group has said, you can't take DNA with you. It's our project, which, to be fair, was true. They'd come up with the idea. She had just been brought in to work on it. And then it gets tricky. This is where it gets murky, because if most people know, or they believe they know, that Jim Watson sees one of Rosalind Franklin's photographs, something called photograph 51, which has got this kind of X shape, and that gives them the double helix. Now, the question in all things is, how do you know that?
Right.
Right? It's expression in science. It's epistemology. How do you know what you know? Even more so in history. And the actual source of this is very, very hard to pin down. Jim Watson in the double helix, he says, it's very vague what he says. He says that he saw, Wilkins showed him some images of the 2 forms of DNA that there were, the A form and the B form. And we know that from a letter that he actually wrote in March 1953. So we've got contemporary evidence. He did see something that excited him and made him sure that they could crack the problem. But if it was so obvious that Jim Watson, this neophyte, who didn't know much about X-ray crystallography at all, he was a zoologist like me, he knew about birds, if he could see it instantly, then how come Rosalind Franklin, this very, very clever, trained physical chemist, how come she didn't get it? So there's a problem in this story, right? It doesn't quite make sense. And to cut a very long story short, what we know from Crick's notes that he wrote in 1960 and from a series of interviews that he did in the middle of the 1960s with Robert Olby, who was the first historian to kind of track his work, we know that, in fact, what Watson and Crick did, they knew that the problem could be solved, but that was more because it seemed to be a simple molecule, unlike the proteins they were studying, which are horrendously complicated. So that's whatever Watson saw, it gave them the idea that it was solvable, it was soluble, they could do it. Yeah. And just using basic chemistry, what was already known, the chemical structure of DNA, and these very simple 2-dimensional models of the components, the bases that they're called, they fiddled around. They later said it was trial and error. They tried anything that would fit. They started off going back like Pauling with 3 strands and with the bases pointing out. So the strands in the middle like this, and then these sticky things like kind of cactus. And that didn't work. The chemistry didn't work. So they went back and they tried over and over and over and over again. And eventually they get Watson is that they're trying to get the bases to fit on the inside, and it doesn't fit. And Watson, literally, he turns one of these bits of cardboard over So the base looks like that, imagine. And then the other base that he's trying to get to fit to it, he turns it like that. And now he can see that the four kinds of bases make two pairs. A and T make a shape, and C and G, as they're called, make the same shape. So now you can imagine we got the strands on the outside, and the rungs of the ladder are always the same size.
Right.
Now, when they saw that, what Crick said was that it fitted with some evidence from Franklin that they had been shown by their boss, Max Perutz. And this evidence was in a semi-public report that Perutz had been given in December, and which, in fact, one of the things I discovered in writing this book, Franklin had kind of invited Crick to find out about, because in January she was giving a farewell talk, January 53. And she, through a friend, she sent a message to Crick saying, "You're welcome to come to this lecture, but it's not going to be not going to be much X-ray crystallographic detail. And Max Perutz, Crick's boss, knows all about it, so you may not think it's worth coming." So this isn't a smoking gun, but it strongly suggests that Franklin was saying, okay, if you want to work on this, this is okay. If you want to know more, ask Max.
Hmm.
So the simple answer is nothing gave Watson and Crick the double helix. It was a lot of luck,
Yeah.
and trying anything and seeing if it would work and fiddling about for 5-6 weeks. And then they were just incredibly lucky. I think that's the real answer.
All
Is that
right.
okay? It was a bit long.
Yeah. I mean,
Did ask.
a lot of people are going to still believe that, right?
Oh, yeah. Pete, there's that XKCD cartoon of the guy at his computer, and his wife says, "Come to bed." And he says, "I can't. Someone is wrong on the internet." Well, that's me, right?
Well, I think the story is, you got into as you say, into the weeds. You really researched this heavily, and
Yeah.
I understand that from all this work, you've tried to clear it up, and people will have their opinions, but I think you've given us at least everything that's known about it. Now, I do want to. There's a real about this. Watson wrote a book, Double Healing, and Crick didn't like the book, uh,
No.
and he basically made stuff up about going to the Eagle Pub and you know all this stuff that never actually happened. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Crick and Wilkins got very, very cross about the double helix for lots of reasons. Partly because of the way he portrayed Franklin, and Wilkins in particular, although Wilkins really didn't like her, was very annoyed about that, and Crick was as well. They were really cross because of what made the book success, because it's written in this brilliant, very easygoing style. You think it's all true. You believe every
Yeah.
word on the page because of the way it's written. And it's all Francis this and Jim that and Morris that and Rosalind the other. So it's very intimate. And that's not how science was at the time. And it's not how scientists who grew up in the 1930s, like Crick and Wilkins, thought that science should be presented. They thought that, well, they weren't professors, either of them, but, Dr. Wilkins and Dr. Crick, if you please, not Morris and Francis, right? And, they're a different generation. They're a different nationality. Neither of them was involved in teaching. Jim was heavily involved with teaching with the young generation. He knew that something was happening, right? It's fairly obvious. The world was changing.
Uh, right.
Something is happening, Mr. Jones, and you don't know what it is. And that's, Crick and Wilkins, they don't get it. Whereas Jim did. He understood what was happening. And he therefore wrote a racy book. And one of the things that my friend Nathaniel Comfort has noticed is that through the drafts, Franklin changes. In the
Oh,
early drafts, she's presented very straight. And then gradually, I think he probably needs, he wants from a novelistic point of view, he wants somebody who you can kind of pick on, who seems to be obtuse, which he wasn't at all. And so he then portrays her increasingly badly in the various drafts. And there's clear echoes of this with a campus novel. And once you think of it about as a campus novel, then these big characters, which they were, right? Then you start to be a bit less confident that everything you're reading is true. And for example, Crick always said, I never said that we've discovered the secret of life. And then in 2016, at the centenary meeting at Cold Spring Harbor, Watson said, yeah, I made it up for dramatic effect. And he told Crick's granddaughter the same thing, you know.
It's
So
amazing.
read the book, but don't believe it.
Believe anything, right? All right. So it didn't stop there, of course, regarding the birth of molecular biology. I'm going to get to the 62 Nobel Prize in a minute, but if that was 53, in 57, um, Francis Crick took it a big step further with the central dogma, and then in 61 with the codon 3 letter. So he wasn't happy with just structure. He wanted to
Yeah.
keep up about what was the functionality of this double helix, and that seemed to be something that was distinctly that he owned. Is that true?
I think so. And I mean, there are lots of people working on these topics, but he's the only person who put it all together. And that's what makes it even more striking. I mean,
Yeah.
so for example, messenger RNA, so the intermediate between DNA and protein, we all know about messenger RNA now because of the fantastic things that it's done for vaccines. And Crick is there at the moment that it is conceptualized, it is born. He and Sidney Brenner have this public or semi-public, there's about 10 people in the room, and they start jabbering about all the various results that people have been working on, and nobody could fit them together. And they suddenly realize that there's this intermediary, and that what happens is that it's like, as they said at the time, it's like a piece of tape. It's like a tape. This information comes from the chromosome, from the DNA, and then it's turned into a bit of RNA, which is like a tape, which then goes through the ribosome, which is this structure that was a bit mysterious, to help the cell make a protein. And that's Crick's thinking, and it's thinking about information. That's what's in a gene. It's information. Now, he's not involved in doing any of the experiments, and other people like Jim Watson did do experiments that also showed that this mRNA existed, and Jacob and Monod had named it, in fact. But it's Crick and Brenner his friend Sidney Brenner, who actually have this idea. So, yeah, he very much, pushed the field forward. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people working in the area by now,
Sure.
but he's the one who actually really, he becomes especially after they've discovered the triplet code, that it's almost certainly the bases are read in 3 letters, groups of 3 letters. And then everybody starts trying to work out what those 3 letters mean, these 64 possible combinations there are. He becomes like the godfather of code, I said.
Yeah.
He travels around from 61 to 65, all over, mainly in America, talking to people, and people send him their preprints and say, look, this is what we found. And he ends up as kind of a clear, the arbiter of
Yeah.
what should be trusted and what shouldn't. Although as an experimentalist, he was generally pretty poor. The 1961 paper you mentioned is a very rare exception of him actually doing an experiment and it didn't end in disaster.
All right. So we see, the big idea man, in work, and of course, getting that corroborated by others as to the functionality aspects of central dogma and codons. Now, in 62, the Nobel Prize is awarded to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins. Was that the
Yeah.
right call?
Well, given that Franklin was dead, yes, I think it was. I mean, ideally, ideally Franklin would have lived much, much longer. But she died in 1958 of ovarian cancer. And the Nobel Prizes technically can't be awarded to people who are dead. And so she wasn't on
Yeah.
the list.
Yeah.
I think, and also they can only be awarded to 3 people. Now, had she lived, my solution, whether the Nobel Prize Committee would have done this is another matter, because we know their record with women scientists. They could have given two people the physiology or medicine and 2 people the chemistry. So they could have
They could.
noted all 4.
Um,
And very strikingly, Crick was asked to, by Jacques Monod, who was nominating him, Crick was asked to write his own nomination, basically. Jacques Monod wrote to him and said, what exactly did you do? Can you tell me? And so Crick writes this little note. And he starts off by saying, you've got to remember that the key work upon which we relied, because they needed to be able to confirm their hypothesis with data, and that came from Rosalind Franklin, also from Maurice Wilkins, but primarily it's from Franklin. And so he says that in his first opening paragraph in this little letter to Jacques Monod, saying how it all happened.
Yeah. Now, before that Nobel Prize, which I think you summed up well, how it was recognized, how it wasn't. But there was a poem that Francis Crick, I guess, stumbled into on a trip in San Francisco in 1959. McClure Peyote. Um, can you tell us about that poem and how it influenced Crick?
Yeah, well, this is something that wasn't known so there are two other biographies of Crick, both of which I think are pretty good. There's Robert Olby's very academic one, which would tell you an awful lot about X-ray crystallography. And there's Matt Ridley's much briefer, very polished, written very soon after Crick died. And they both interviewed Crick loads of times, which I never did. I never met him. But they didn't pick up on this. And indeed, none of his colleagues who knew him very well, who are still living, had ever any idea of this connection. So in 1959, Crick is there in finishing a sabbatical in America. He's staying in Berkeley, and he goes into San Francisco. They go to the City Lights bookstore, which is still there, the heart of the Beat movement. And he goes, because he's interested in poetry, he goes down into the basement, which is where all the poems are. And he finds this long broadsheet, this thing that is, it's huge. This very strange poem written by this guy called Michael McClure, and it's called Peyote Poem, and it describes the effects of eating peyote, which is the active ingredient of which is mescaline. So just as Aldous Huxley had written, The Doors of Perception about 6 years earlier, what McClure is doing is giving a very vivid poetic expression to it. And Crick is utterly entranced by this very strange piece of poetry, buys this very now extremely rare document, takes it home, pins it on the wall. Later on, it's next to a copy of the genetic code, which he helped to crack. And so I thought this is astonishing. This is what is going on here. And in fact, he ends up very good friends with McClure. And McClure's kind of psychedelic beat poetry is very muscular. It's got lots about biology and animals, and they really hit it off. What Crick liked about McClure is this kind of ecstatic experience that he describes in all his poems, which Crick later on went on to smoke cannabis. He took LSD a number of times. He may have taken mescaline or even eaten peyote. I don't know about that. But I think what he got was the ecstatic experience of discovery, of knowledge, of insight. There was one particular stanza which Crick loved, which went you've got to imagine this in capital letters and italics. So I guess it's got to be yelled in tone. This is the powerful knowledge. We smile with it.
Yeah.
And this was all said by the man who is the god of foxes or something. The poem's fantastic. You can find it on the internet.
No,
Don't try and understand what it means. Just read it out loud and really get into it.
I had to read it because I was so curious. But written by a person who's, on drugs. Now, Crick was a drug user. Did he do psychedelics with or other drugs with McClure?
I don't know. Somebody was asked me this today on Blue Sky. They said, is there much about psychedelics in this? I said, well, it starts with that and closes in a way, because it closes with a rather nice poem that McClure wrote for him, finished on the day of his death in 2004. So I put in as much as I could find, but there's very, very little.
Well, he probably would. Right?
We know that he signed, along with all four Beatles, a petition for the legalization of cannabis in 1967, which was, very, very scandalous at the time. He was the only fellow of the Royal Society to sign it. And he was an ardent defender of that idea. And he used cannabis quite regularly, I think. LSD, not quite so often, but certainly in the second half of the 60s, that was something that he experimented with and enjoyed, or was fascinated by its effects on perception, because his interest was moving away from molecular genetics towards thinking about that other great issue, the consciousness. And now we've got this drug, which is not just, changing the way alcohol or caffeine changes your mind. But this is completely altering your perception. And that, I think, intrigued him a great deal.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the next pivot of Crick's life. The first one being from physics to molecular biology. And as you said, even in 1947, he knew he was going to get to consciousness.
Yeah,
And so he's forced into retirement from MRC in Cambridge. And somehow he lands in La Jolla at the Salk Institute. I guess also perhaps his friend Sidney Brenner played a role in that. But he now is going to eventually, after he gets legs on this, because it wasn't right straight away, at the Salk Institute, he's going to start a career in understanding consciousness, right?
yeah,
And this culminates with his work of Christoph Koch in a book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. It's actually astonishing, the scientific search for the soul. And
yeah,
you know, this, to me, there's the text in that book where it says, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." I mean, that's an astonishing hypothesis, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, he says something like, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons," which is
Right.
taken from Alice in Wonderland or Alice in the Looking Glass. I can't remember which. The one where the Queen of Hearts and all the cards are attacking her, and she says, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," and they all disappear. So Crick is saying we're nothing but a pack of neurons. And in fact, a folk singer wrote a song about it, which he was very taken with. So, I mean, it is astonishing. On the other hand, it's what I think most neuroscientists would have said. There is no soul, or there's certainly no spirit. The word soul in the title is a bit of a cheat. It was partly there to get people to buy it. I mean, there's very little about the soul in the book. He says something like, I mean, so he was an agnostic with very strong atheist tendencies. I think, like most scientists, who would claim to be atheists, in fact, they're really an agnostic because just maybe there's possibility, but there's no evidence. So what he said was, when we've understood consciousness, then we'll know whether there's anything left over. Right? If there's something missing, then maybe that could be a soul. But that's it. So really, what he's doing is trying to sum up materialist approaches to thought, to the mind, to brain function, which, I mean, his editor got cross with him and said, why is this astonishing? Doesn't everybody think this? And he basically said, you need to get out more and talk to religious people, because religious people will get very cross with you. And that's who he's aiming at. So most of the book is a summary of neuroscience as it stood at the time. And although it's out of print now, it was extremely influential. I was very surprised at quite the huge impact it had on both sides of the Atlantic. I've met eminent neuroscientists who said that's what got me into neuroscience. I read that and I was inspired. It was a huge thing in the UK. It went to the top of the bestseller. The Times had a front page article comparing him with Mozart and Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just Newton and Mendel. We're now talking about Mozart and Shakespeare. It's quite extraordinary. And in a way, I think this is telling us that something's happened. I've got to think about this. Who today, what individual scientist would you name as being somebody incredibly famous and influential? Probably Fauci would be, in the US, would be one of the people you could talk about. But there are very few such eminent individual scientists. The people we think are scientists are, in fact, science communicators. They may have a scientific training, but when they're talking about something, they're not talking about their work. And there's very few books by scientists or TV programs or whatever simply about their work that have had such an influence. And that's partly because science is more complicated. It's done by teams. But it's also, and people are wary of, great men and all the rest of it, which is all fair enough. But there's something else has changed, I think, in our attitude towards scientists and their willingness to put themselves to the fore in arguing their science and explaining it and so on. And it tends to be mediated now by kind of, TV figures or TikTok influencers or Substackers or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, he may have taken some lessons from Watson, but for the most part, scientists kept to science, and they didn't
Yeah.
appeal to the public, and they certainly didn't, come up with things that were more to get people interested in their work outside of their microcosm of the science community. Now, he came to the Salk Institute in '76. That book,
Yeah, he'd worked there. He'd been a founder member. He'd been a founder fellow. So he was recruited specially by Jonas Salk as being kind of a special fellow whose job was to find new people who would be permanent researchers working at the Salk. So he'd been in for about 10 years. He kind of had like dual membership, and he had to travel a great deal, which he found exhausting. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
But in '76, he moves there permanently and is, yeah.
And then it was '94 when this book came out, The
Yeah.
Astonishing Hypothesis, and he worked uh, on science. He was editing papers to this very last day. I mean, he had colon
Yeah.
cancer diagnosed in 2001, and 3 years into that diagnosis, when he ultimately died, but he was working on science and papers and editing even to his last day. Is that true?
That's absolutely right. You can see in the archives there is the manuscript of this book article he was writing with Christoph Koch on the claustrum, which is this very thin, rather mysterious layer in the brain, which they didn't think was the seat of consciousness, but they thought it was doing something interesting. Crick would look for anatomical structures that could perhaps play some kind of intermediate or relay role or some gathering of information role in case that might be, as they put it, the site of neural correlates of consciousness, not necessarily where it is, but something that's consistently linked to it. And on the manuscript, you've got his very, very shaky hand as he's changing words here and there. Christoph had to spend quite a few months afterwards knocking it into shape because it still was a bit strange. But eventually it was published in 2005.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So we have here the hunter of life's secrets, and spawning in many ways two huge fields, molecular biology, and then he pivoted over to neuroscience. And in fact, if you could say the whole AI world of today is really the same kind of theme of it's all about these neurons, whether they're human neurons or artificial neurons and networks. So, what he did, the legacy in science of two huge fields that he
Yeah, absolutely.
pioneered,
So, I
right?
mean, he ended up. I mean, again, he was lucky. He was in the right place at the right time, just like he was in Cambridge. Because he was in San Diego. That was the site of something called the Parallel Distributed Program Group, which was a set of information scientists, computer scientists, psychologists who tried to bring all this together. And this is the embryo of today's AIs. And Geoffrey Hinton, who helped co-won the Nobel Prize, and John Hopfield, who co-won the Nobel Prize in 2024 for their work, they were intimately linked with Crick and with this broader group. And he wasn't involved in doing any of the program. I found a rather sad letter from him saying he was trying to learn BASIC when he was about 70, and it was really, really hard, and he couldn't do it. But he would be sitting there. They'd have these meetings in San Diego and at the university, and he'd sit at the back on a sofa, and he'd kind of be very annoying and saying, all this is very well, but what about the biology? So one of the issues that we still have today was being played out there with Crick on the sofa saying, look, if you want this to tell you about the brain, it's got to be biologically significant. And if you're relying on ways of these components interacting that is biologically impossible, then that's going to be great. You're going to have a fantastic system, but it won't tell you about biology. And that was what he wanted to link structure and function in a realistic and scientific way.
Yeah, no, it's phenomenal. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about Odile and Michael, his family. I mean, they were married 55 years, despite
Yeah.
some might be considered an open marriage, but also Odile drew the picture, the graphic for the classic Nature 1953 paper, which was amazing.
Yeah.
And he wrote to Michael's son right around the discovery about how this beautiful structure. And I mean, his son Michael was like 12 or something at the time.
That's right. Yeah.
So tell us
I
a
mean,
little.
I think that's his experience with the Children's Encyclopedia comes out because the letter is just so clear. It explains. I mean, he was lucky, right? This is one of the things about DNA that people forget is that most molecular structures tell you nothing, or it's impossible to see what the function is, right? If you see a hemoglobin molecule, you cannot look at it and go, "Aha, that's carrying oxygen." It just doesn't look like that. The double helix is almost, I think, actually unique in that you can immediately see what its function, the link between function and structure, and you can explain it to a 12-year-old, as Crick did to his son in this very famous letter that Michael eventually auctioned and gave a lot of the money to the Salk Institute for.
Yeah. And so, anything else about his family that you want to mention?
Well, his granddaughter Kindra is a neuroscientist and an artist. She's a very famous artist, so she's kind of fused the two sides of the family. Michael, who is from his Crick's first marriage, went on to work for Microsoft. So apparently, spell check, if you get cross with that in Word, that's Michael's fault. And Gabrielle, his surviving daughter, is a very accomplished artist who lives in London. So that fusion of art and science, which was part of the Crick's marriage. I mean, O'Deal did draw the double helix, but she drew figures for many of his
Mm.
papers,
Oh, right.
including of this very strange one of mermaids intertwined that Crick used to explain something rather complicated about X-ray crystallography in the 1950s. And their house was full of art, always had art around it. It was mainly O'Deal who chose it, but Francis was very interested in that, and poetry, and also these parties that were very wild in Cambridge, and I think were probably a bit calmer in San Diego. I'm not sure people
I
would have
don't-
approved.
Yeah. So I'm only a few blocks away from the Salk Institute at Scripps,
Yeah,
and obviously Crick was a legend, and I hear all kinds of stories. And he would have parties, but also they had the place in Borrega Springs, which is just over an hour away in the desert. I mean,
yeah,
the desert, and they would be there quite a bit. So they
yeah.
had the best of both worlds, the ocean and the desert. And I think he really loved the Salk Institute.
Oh,
And
he adored it. I mean, I didn't make perhaps enough. I did think about this partly because this is something that historians are interested in. Place. So it's a story. His life is also a story of two subjects. It's also two places. It's Cambridge, where he was able to do his molecular work, but it's also the Salk. The Salk was incredibly important to him in uh, giving him a connection with American science, which, of course, is the powerhouse of all. The work he was interested in, most of it, the really important work was being done in the USA. And the Salk, by those regular visits, gave him that contact and then eventually becoming a full-time fellow. And he said he never took American citizenship. He didn't feel American,
mm,
but he did feel Californian, and he loved Southern California. And they built this house in the desert in Borrego Springs in 1992 or something. Francis designed it. He'd always had a penchant for designing houses and stuff. Amateur architect, and it's very carefully designed so that on the basis apparently of a Japanese inn. So each window, you don't look onto another room. You look onto this central area, which was there was a patch of bare desert. So there's lots and lots of lovely flowers because he adored gardening, but there's also a patch of bare desert as a memory, or a memory of what was, but also a hint of what was going to come eventually.
yeah.
It'll all go back to desert. And they built this house, and the colors and so on of the sunsets is what he adored. And I realized that would be very Michael McClure went to visit them a number of times. That kind of just the sensation, the visual sensation, and the heat and the smells of the desert flowers, that would all fit in with McClure's very, very sensual, poetic understanding. That was part of Crick, which you don't get from reading his scientific papers. You don't get this much more intimate and sensual side of somebody which you can relate to, because you may not particularly like McClure's poetry, or we might, but we can all understand that joy, the fun he found in the world and in understanding it.
Well, that's what this book accomplishes. That you bring him back to life.
That's
You
very kind of you.
intimate portrait of a man who had profound influence in life science, but also his foibles, his
Yeah.
traits. You don't. hold back on these. Now, at in the UK, there's a famous institute, the Crick. And the Crick, obviously, we know Crick who cracked the code or whatever. Crick, has this unbelievably distinguished track record in contribution to science. And some people would have, a negative perception of him as well. I mean, it's that mixed, right? It's hard to the good and the bad. Um, can you tell us about the Crick? And that is, I guess, the singular institute identified with his um,
Yeah.
very contributions, right?
Yeah. I mean, I should preface it by saying if anybody asks my advice, which they don't, I wouldn't advise naming a building or an institute after an individual. It's just kind of fraught with dangers. You don't know what the future's going to hold because, opinions change. And what can be seen as acceptable in one generation is seen as utterly awful in another. Now, so the Crick was set up, I think it was opened in 2008, something like that, 2009. It's this huge, great big building right by King's Cross and St Pancras. So if you come in if you've been in Europe and you come in on the Eurostar, the train under the Channel, you can come out right next to the Francis Crick Institute, where his name is literally written in stone.
Yeah.
And so it's devoted to molecular biology and to neuroscience, to the life sciences in general. When it was being proposed, before it was called this, there was a lot of dispute in the British scientific community. Was it going to just suck up all our money, right? They've been putting all this money into this big project. And it's in London as well, so those of us who aren't in London got very annoyed. But I think it has so far proven its worth. It's run by Sir Paul Nurse, who used to run Rockefeller and is also the incoming president of the Royal Society. And it has been tremendous in terms of the work that it's done, both on things like early embryonic development. So there's very important work going on to understand why miscarriages take place and to understand, therefore, the very early stages of embryonic development, but also fundamental research on, so what I spent all my career studying on Drosophila, the tiny little fly that scientists study. There's scientists working on that, not in a biomedical orientation, but just trying to understand fundamental things. There's people working on ancient DNA. There's absolutely everything goes on there.
Yeah, it's actually striking. In fact, Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind has set up collaborations with the Crick on drug discovery with AI,
Yeah,
labs and whatnot. Now, it started just before Crick died.
yeah.
Did
I think
he?
they started talking about the funding. They
Uh,
didn't name it till after he was dead. Yeah.
he well, but he probably would be quite proud of it if he was here today. I would.
Mhm. Well, a mixture. I mean, he was very private. Okay, so all biographers feel this. This is the first biography I've written. I'm not sure I'm going to write another one. Certainly not about one where there are people who are still alive, because you spend a lot, you be a terrible nosy Parker, you go around rummaging around in people's private lives, and
Yeah.
the family, it's not an authorized biography, but the family have been amazingly tolerant for me digging around, including in the less salubrious aspects of their father's life or their grandfather's life, which understandably they're not particularly proud of and wouldn't want people to focus on. I don't think they should. But they've been amazingly supportive and tolerant of that. So he was very, very private, and that's one of the things he didn't like about the double helix, because if you read the double helix with the eyes, if you read carefully, it's all there. Crick's penchant for parties, for womanizing, his lechery. Is all there. It's Jim hints at it, and you read it, and then you go, oh, this is what it's saying. So Francis wasn't happy about that, understandably so. And I think he would be proud, but he said in something like in the Millennium, the Wedgwood Plate Company, they make porcelain plates. They wanted to have a picture of all the great discoverers of science of the Millennium, and Crick wasn't happy, and he said, well, I think the discovery is more important than the individual. And
Well,
in the end, they went for the object. So at 12 o'clock was the double helix, which he was very happy about. So
yeah.
he thought that, and in general, actually, that's in a way, it's true, right? Because, I mean, we discover things. I mean, you discovered a lot more important things than I have. My discoveries are fairly minor, and, somebody else would have made them. If I wasn't here, it's nothing terribly important. That's the nature of science. We all make tiny little contributions. And that's true of the double helix. I think if Watson and Crick hadn't found it, then, it would have been discovered in a few months by somebody, by Wilkins or by Franklin or by Pauling, or somebody would have found it.
Sure.
But individuals do make a difference. And that's, to go back to our starting point, his thinking, his way of thinking about what DNA meant, and his ability to then focus much later on consciousness. I mean, he created the field of consciousness studies as a scientific field, not as a philosophical,
Right.
pipe-sucking musing on what life might be like. So individuals do count as well. It's quite complicated, the history of science.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think I have no problem with them naming it after him. They, every now and again, people get cross when they discover
Well,
stuff that's on his Wikipedia page.
right.
And the Crick have got a clear kind of disclaimer, which I think is fair enough, saying, he was a great scientist. We don't subscribe to all his views, which is, yeah, fair enough.
Well, the reason I brought it up in part was because here, not far from the Salk Institute, is the Venter Institute that Craig
Yeah.
Venter for himself. Okay.
Yeah.
So, little different, little different. Okay.
I think they're rather different characters.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We won't go into that anymore, depth, right? Now, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think this is such an extraordinary book, and that you say you wouldn't do another biography. I don't know. This is a masterpiece. It's a tome. It's a big book.
It's a big book.
It's a big book. Almost 600 pages. But
It's got a different cover in the UK.
Yeah.
It's perhaps the other way around. I can't tell if this is. You can read it. This is the UK version. So the UK version also has lovely end papers.
Oh, right.
So this is the blackboard that Crick and Brenner wrote on, which is a photo of, and so the text is absolutely identical.
No,
This is just a bit fancier.
the guy here looks more like a madman.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's taken at the Salk, and
Right.
cover, as covers and publishers, they do what they want.
Yeah, yeah.
I had nothing to do with either version.
Okay, so in closing, did we miss any? I mean, you couldn't cover in an hour's discussion. We couldn't cover this incredible work.
No, I think you did. I think the only thing I'd add is that although he did do these things, the other thread that runs through the book is he always had somebody else. He had to have another researcher, whether it was Sidney Brenner, Jim Watson, Christoph Koch, Peter Lawrence. Every stage, they were mainly men, mainly young, always younger than him, sometimes mainly from different countries. So there was kind of like something else. If he could just talk to himself, that would have been useless. He needed somebody else who he could argue with in this very confrontational but friendly style. You had to be able to say whatever you've thought and come up with crazy ideas, and the person you're talking to could shoot them down, or you could then develop them. Brenner called these mad sessions that they had.
Yeah.
And that is, he had time to think. When asked what he did, he said, I read and I think. Most academics don't have that, right? He was privileged to have a research-only job and working in a field where he could just think and come up with ideas, partly because he was clever, partly because of the areas he was working in. He didn't have to ask for money, as I said, just one big grant in his whole life.
Amazing.
So in a way, he was living in an idyllic age. For most scientists today wouldn't recognize that, would be impossible. He never graded a paper. He never did any of apart from the year or so that he actually ran the Salk, which was a disaster and nearly killed him. He had nothing to do with administration. Whenever he was asked, he'd say, I know nothing about it and I'm very poor at it. I think that the main thing is his collaborative work. None of his discoveries came simply from him. It was from this interaction with somebody else that he could really, and he developed that with somebody we haven't mentioned, a very strange bloke called George Kreisel, who was a mathematician,
Right.
Who he met during the war. And Kreisel was a philosopher and a magician as well as a mathematician. He knew Wittgenstein, introduced Crick to Wittgenstein, all sorts of things. And he taught Crick how to think. He made Crick think in this very precise way and ask questions and challenge ideas in these very intense interactions that he had with his colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I found that his antibodies to dogma, and of course his central dogma, that is something that in the spirit of science we can't get enough of. Just not to
Yeah.
accept that
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
Hatbox hemoglobin story and all these other things that weren't right. And he was never. And it's interesting you bring out that he had a foil. He had someone else that
Yeah,
he was
always.
with to be able to really attack the dogma and to get it right. So anyway, Matthew, this has been exhilarating. I've so
Been
enjoyed
great.
conversation, and I've so enjoyed this book. It kept me
Thank
busy.
you very much.
And I hope everybody who has any interest in life science gets a chance to read it, because they're going to learn a lot about historic discoveries, not just in the life science of DNA and life itself, but also in our brain, in our mind, and in the neuroscience world. So thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks, Eric. It's been a fantastic experience. I hope everybody who's watching now live and later on finds it interesting and is inspired to go and look at the book in your library, or even to buy a copy or to listen to a copy, because there's a good audio book too. And this has been a really good conversation. It's been fantastic.
And we're going to look forward to your next book on heredity in are you
About 3 years, another 3 years.
okay? Well, keep up the great work. Thanks so much,
Thanks.
man. All right. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.